Putin's come to the conviction that the way to create space for Russia as a major power on the international landscape is to chip away at an American-led order.
He's the most powerful Kremlin leader since Stalin. There's an open for you. Hello and welcome to GZERO World. I'm Ian Bremmer, and today I'll get an insider's look at Russian President Vladimir Putin. To help me do it is a veteran diplomat who's dealt with the Russian president directly and lives to tell the tale. Former U.S. Ambassador to Russia, Bill Burns. Don't worry, I've also got your puppet regime.
Now let's get started before sanctions cut out the electricity.
This is the story of a Soviet intelligence officer disguised as a German, operating deep behind enemy lines inside Nazi Germany. The hero, a handsome and courageous young Soviet, secretly disrupts the Nazi war effort by mastering German and infiltrating the Schutzstaffel, or SS, an elite paramilitary corps under Adolf Hitler. In 1968, with Vladimir Putin not even 16 years old, that narrative was made into a wildly popular screenplay and television series. For Putin, an impressionable young student from Leningrad, it was a turning point. Captivated, as the story goes, he knew then he wanted to become a spy. One man's effort could achieve what whole armies could not, Putin later recalled. One spy could decide the fate of thousands of people. To begin to understand the man who became Russia's president, annexing Crimea, meddling in U.S. elections, and placing himself pivotally in the Middle East, it helps to know his past, particularly one dark night in Dresden, East Germany, just weeks after the fall of the Berlin Wall. December 5, 1989. Crowds of mostly young men, emboldened by a communist system now on life support, stormed the Dresden headquarters of East Germany's secret police. They then turned their attention to the local KGB office, where Vladimir Putin, by now a young Soviet intelligence officer, is working. As the crowd approaches, Putin calls in military support, looking for protection by way of Soviet troops. But those troops need authorization from Moscow. And the answer he receives, according to Putin's own account, would linger with him for years. Moscow, the dispatch replies, is silent. That sound of the Kremlin's silence surely stayed with him as NATO expanded missile defenses and brought in new members from across Central and Eastern Europe, encroaching on Moscow's traditional sphere of influence. But by 2007, Putin, now president of Russia, had had enough. He would let the world know during a speech in Munich that his country had regained its voice and would no longer tolerate Western dominance in global affairs.
Но есть ли у нас средства, чтобы противостоять этим угрозам? Конечно, есть.
After nearly 2 decades, Putin has since reasserted Kremlin influence in the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, and Europe. He's an opportunist. He's ready to project power. And yet, he also has faded at home, fed by a lackluster economy, U.S. sanctions, low oil prices, and declining living standards. Putin's term ends in 2024, for what that's worth, and protests are simmering. But a lot can happen in 4 years. Frankly, a lot can happen in 1 year, especially if you look at Moscow's old rival. For now, America has a president with whom Putin has spoken privately at least 16 times, and whose transactional dealings have had real impacts on U.S. allies and American durability abroad. For the old KGB officer who glamorized movie star spies as a boy, chafed at the memory of Dresden, and still resents NATO's expansion, Trump represents an opportunity. Thing is, November elections are right around the corner, and a less agreeable American president may be in waiting. As for meddling in that election,
I'll tell you in a secret. Yes, we will definitely intervene. It's a secret.
is $2.5 million roughly enough for a lousy embassy?
I don't think that's the quality that I would.
Ambassador Bill Burns, president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, author of The Back Channel. Bill, wonderful to see you here.
Thanks. It's great to be with you, Ian.
So I want to ask, talk a little bit. I mean, you've interacted with President Putin a fair amount, individually.
I have.
Tell me what that insight that has given you into where our relationship is with them right
Well,
now.
much of my gray hair came from my 2 tours, over 5 or 6 years in the Foreign Service.
Well, that's
serving in
a
Russia.
lot of gray hair.
It
I mean,
is, yeah. First in the early 90s in Boris Yeltsin's Russia, and then when I was ambassador to Russia about a decade ago, 2005 to 2008. And I've actually always thought that if you want to understand Putin's Russia, it helps to have understood Boris Yeltsin's Russia, a Russia that was flat on its back. A sense of hope, surely, with the end of communism, but also mixed with a sense of humiliation and uncertainty as well. Putin today is a combustible combination of grievance and ambition and insecurity all wrapped together. I vividly remember my first meeting with Putin as the newly arrived U.S. ambassador at the Kremlin, which, as you know, is built on a scale that's meant to intimidate visitors, especially newly arrived American
Since Putin
ambassadors.
is not
Putin, no.
built on a scale to intimidate visitors.
Not built on a scale.
Yeah.
His persona is
Yes,
meant
indeed.
to intimidate. So anyway, you go into the Kremlin, you walk down through these huge halls, down long corridors. You come to the end of one huge hall. There are these 2-story bronze doors. Kept waiting there for a few minutes just to let all this sink in. The door cracks open, out comes Vladimir Putin, who, despite his bare-chested persona, is actually not that intimidating in the flesh, but he comes walking through the door with great self-assurance. Before I got a word out of my mouth, said, "You Americans need to listen more. You can't have everything your own way anymore. We can have effective relations, but not just on your terms." Now that
was the start.
Yeah, that was
That's
the opening
welcome
of
to
our
Russia.
relation as ambassador, but it was vintage Vladimir Putin. It was not subtle. It was almost defiantly charmless, but the message was clear that his Russia was going to push back. If he was convinced, as many others in the Russian political elite are, that the United States and the West more generally took advantage of Russia's moment of historical weakness in the 90s. And I'm not trying to justify that, but that's the perception anyway.
You'd argue that there's some truth to that.
Some, but I mean, there's also some truth in the sense that Russians were never going to be comfortable with, junior partner status, and we're always going to look for ways to push back. But if that's his perception of the way in which Russia interacted with the United States in the 90s, when he saw a moment of weakness, dysfunction, polarization in our political system in 2016, he was quick to try to take advantage of it as well. He's an apostle of payback in that sense.
And do you consider him to be an actively hostile in every arena with the U.S. strategically, or do you think there are areas where cooperation with Russia can meaningfully be attempted?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty narrow band in dealing with Putin's Russia between the sharply competitive and the nastily adversarial. But even within that band, there's a need for guardrails. In arms control in particular. We're about to see the collapse of what's left of the old arms control architecture.
With the pullout of the intermediate nuclear forces.
The intermediate nuclear forces agreement.
Which they were breaching.
Right, which they were. And this is as a result of Russian violations. And so in many ways, the INF treaty was on its last legs anyway.
Russia has refused to take any steps to return real and verifiable compliance over these 60 days. The United States will therefore suspend its obligations under the INF Treaty effective February 2nd.
The bigger challenge, I think, is going to be the New START agreement reached in the last administration, which reduces and limits and verifies strategic nuclear weapons. That's going to expire at the beginning of 2021 unless Russian and American leaderships make a more serious effort to try to extend it. So you need to have those guardrails. But you have to also be realistic and operate without illusions about the many ways in which Putin's Russia and Putin himself are going to try to push back against American interests, in part because I think he's come to the conviction that the way to create space for Russia as a major power on the international landscape is to chip away at an American-led order. So I think it's extraordinarily important for the United States not to give in to Putin's aggressiveness. On the other hand, I think it's important for us not to give up on the Russia that lies beyond Putin. There's a middle class in Russia today which chafes at corruption.
And they're getting angrier, yeah.
They are. Second, I think, much as we were discussing before, Russians didn't like being the junior partner of the United States after the end of the Cold War. They're going to chafe at being China's junior partner
yeah.
as you look at over the next decade.
Why isn't Putin chafing more at that?
I think right now it's convenient in a lot of ways to make common cause with China again to chip away at an American
But he clearly
order.
gets that the Chinese are increasingly dominating economically his part of the world in a way the Americans are not.
Yeah, no, and he's the ultimate realist, Putin is, if not the ultimate cynic. I mean, he understands very well that if you look at the vast expanse of Russia, from the Ural Mountains all the way across Siberia to the Russian Far East, there's only today about 40 million Russians.
Right.
Sitting on just about everything in the periodic table of elements and looking across a very long border at 1 billion for Chinese. And so, you know, there's a reason that Russians feel insecure sometimes. So over the long term, my only point is, you know, as a matter of American strategy, we need to be conscious of that because there's space for artful American diplomacy as you look out beyond Putin. In the short term, you know, I think we have to be realistic about what we're dealing with.
In the short term, were we right to unilaterally withdraw from the INF agreement?
I don't think we had much choice. I think we might have handled it in a way that, you know, tried to expose more publicly the ways in which the Russians were violating, that made more of an effort to build allied support. But, you know, those are tactical concerns, and in the end, I think we're right.
Talking to you is frequently a talk about calibration, but incremental steps, thoughtful coalition building. I mean, career ambassador, you have the foreign policy mustache. It's better than some in foreign policy. But when the world changes a lot, and when institutions change very slowly, at what point is it important not to do calibrated? At what point, how does one go and suddenly say, actually, we need to shake things up?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think certainly I go back to the early part of my career. Again, granted, at a moment of maximum American influence in the world in the Bush 41 administration. You know, in hindsight, German reunification, less than a year after the fall of the Berlin Wall, with a unified Germany remaining in NATO, in hindsight, that looks foreordained. It didn't look that way at the time.
Threatening to the Europeans at the time.
Exactly right. And many of those European leaders contained their enthusiasm for that prospect at the time. And it was certainly not a sure thing with Gorbachev or SHEVARDNADZE or others around him as they were watching their own country, the Soviet Union, collapse. Nor did it seem a sure thing at the time when Bush and Baker and Scowcroft, you know, mobilized a quite impressive international coalition to expel Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. So, you know, those are examples in my experience of people being willing to take bold steps rather than incremental steps because they understood what was at stake in that moment.
Trump has no shortage of bold. But is there a bold thing out there right now that the U.S. isn't doing as the world's still largest superpower that it needs to be?
Oh, sure.
What's a bold thing?
Well, I mean, I think the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015 was an incremental step in many respects.
We are the first generation to feel the impact of climate change and the last generation that can do something about it.
But if there's one area in which bold American leadership is really required right now, I think it's in terms of climate and the threat that it poses.
And what would that
us.
look like? I mean, what's the German reunification support equivalent of that?
Yeah, I don't know what that is. I think it has to do with a bolder approach to the way in which we deal with, you know, the climate consequences for our own economy. I'm not an advocate of a Green New Deal necessarily, but I mean, I think thinking in very ambitious terms about what we need to do at home, and then, you know, being able to mobilize a coalition of countries that share that same sense of urgency is really important.
I mean, I guess I would argue that'd be the place where you'd want to see boldness in the U.S.-China relationship.
Yeah. I think that's right.
Because they're the big emitters.
They're the big emitters. We have a bigger stake almost than anybody else, and we have a bigger impact on the way in which climate change is going to affect the rest of the planet. So, you know, there's an opportunity, I think, but in the context of the current U.S.-China relationship, that gets a lot harder to do.
So what gives you most cause for hope for the future of U.S. diplomacy going forward?
Oh, I mean, I end the book by talking about the fact that I'm still a long-term optimist. I mean, I'm optimistic about the resilience of American society, optimist in the sense that I think reality imposes itself on us, and we are operating on a landscape in which diplomacy really is more important even than it was at the moment of paramount American influence 30 years ago at the end of the Cold War. It's going to take, you know, I think strong American leadership to drive that home to people, because the truth is, as you know very well, Ian, there's a pretty big domestic disconnect in our country right now between people like me, card-carrying members of the Washington establishment who preach the virtues of disciplined American leadership, armed with diplomacy in the world, and lots of Americans who don't need to be persuaded so much, in my experience at least, of the value of active American engagement in the world, but they're skeptical about the disciplined part, because they've seen too many instances in administrations of both parties, but most graphically in Iraq in 2003 and the global financial crisis, of indiscipline on the part of the United States. So you got to recognize that disconnect and be honest with people, and then try to explain the significance of American diplomacy, smartly applied, as a way not only to advance our interests and our values in the world, but also to start to bridge that disconnect a little bit.
Ambassador Bill Burns, in a world of 140 characters, he speaks in well-formed paragraphs. Great to be with you.
It's great to be with you, and thanks so much.
Nice to be back at the Dickies, where every award is a lifetime achievement. I said every award is a lifetime achievement award. That's more like it. Now let's get started before sanctions cut out the electricity. First award, best script for staying in power forever, goes to Vladimir Putin.
Thank you. If you don't know, now you know. Thank you.
What a guy. Next, the Comeback Kid Award goes to Mohammed bin Salman.
Thank you. I just want to thank all my friends that stood by me through all the yada, yada, yada in 2018. Oh, you guys are the best. Oh, man, this is crazy.
A great segue to our next award, Best Encouragement of Dictatorship in a Supporting Role. This goes to one of our rising stars and a very good friend of mine, Mr. Donald J. Trump.
Thank you. The world is a very scary place. And I mean this what is with this Obama killed lots of birds, beautiful birds, and then they tried to impeach me for a perfect goal. And I was acquitted.
Okay, get out of here, okay? Who does he think he is? Fidel Castro? And now the big one. Best suppression of an ethnic minority in a leading role. This was a tough one. We saw strong work this year from India's Narendra Modi, from Turkey's President Erdogan, from Georgia Governor Brian Kemp. So many contenders. But in the end, we chose Xi Jinping for his work on the indie project Xinjiang.
That's our show this week. But if you like what you've seen, check us out at GZEROmedia.com.